Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event. Today, I want to present about a boundary object called the Counterdata set. So to get started, we first need to introduce a recent book that I've co-authored together with Lauren Klein, who's a professor down at Emory University in Atlanta. So our book is called Data Feminism, and I'm going to describe a little bit about the motivation for writing the book and some of the principles that come out of it as a way of setting the scene for what we mean by the counter data set. So we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for basically making racist, sexist, and classist data products. So these are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote women's resumes, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, all these things and more. And whereas, the era of big data was sort of heralded by this meme that you see here out of The Economist, this idea of data as being the new oil. This is a kind of meme that we characterize as because it's traveled so far and so wide, and you can actually watch mashups of this on YouTube of many people saying this over and over and over again. And the metaphors are sort of apt. So if we think about the metaphors that we apply to extractive industries like oil, where we mine, we capture, we clean, we process, and so on. There's been a growing pushback against this kind of extractive industry notion of data. Because like we know with oil, the actual profits that are reaped from such extractive industries tend to benefit the people who are using this metaphor in a kind of a positive way. And this pushback has been coming for maybe the past 5 years and really growing. And this is some of the work that you see on the bottom of the slide that has been inspirational to us as we have written our book. And largely the pushback is coming from Black and Indigenous women of color, from white women, from Indigenous people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ people, and more. And in very different ways and in different mediums, they say something like, data is the same old oppression. So in fact, instead of being liberated by our data sets and data systems and our algorithms, we are in fact accelerating and exacerbating existing inequalities in the world. And so what we bring to this conversation with our book is a focus on feminism and intersectional feminism in particular. So we like to be clear about what our definition of feminism is. So feminism is a belief in equal rights for all genders. It's organized activity to realize those rights. And it's also, and I think very excitingly, an intellectual heritage. And it's a heritage that has thought deeply about ethics and inequality. And one very important thing to note is that feminism in the year 2020 must be understood as being intersectional. So this is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And she uses this term to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by one dimension of difference. So we can't only be looking at sexism when we're looking at inequality. We have to talk about the intersection of many forces of oppression that produce it, meaning racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. And so this is an important takeaway because what this means is that intersectional feminism is not only about women. It's not even only about gender, it's about power, thinking about who has power and who does not have power. So our basic argument is that intersectional feminism can help challenge and change the unequal distribution of power that we currently see in data science in so many different ways that we both document in the book and that others have detailed. And in fact, if data science hopes to do what we call good in the world, it actually really needs an intersectional feminist perspective to do that. So the book has 7 principles. There's not really time to go into all of them in a short talk today, but this is more or less how the book is also structured. So we sort of take one principle per chapter and we try to introduce the feminist thinkers that sort of led to formulating this principle, as well as folks in the world who are using data in the service of realizing that principle. So trying to show that data feminism is something that can be done and is already being done by a variety of folks who are already doing things in the world. So I'm just going to talk about a couple examples and sort of pivot to this idea of the counter data set. So in the book, and this is right in the first chapter, when we're talking about examining power, we tell the story of Mimi Onwoha's efforts to collect what she calls missing data sets. And so she's an artist. And these missing data sets are basically just a list. These are data sets that a reasonable person may expect to exist. So things like the number of citizens killed by police, or the number of men versus women with cases of coronavirus. But these data sets don't exist. So Onwoha takes an analysis of power, this first principle of ours, in her art project, and she asks why. So why do we have detailed data on things like guinea pig teeth, but not police violence? While there's a lot of discussion about bias in data sets and algorithms, we also have to consider which data are not even collected in the first place due to systemic bias. So it's here where I want to introduce the idea that a boundary object for machine learning may be considered as being this counter data set. So in data feminism, we discuss counter data collection as activist data collection that challenges power, meaning it directly challenges racism, sexism, and so on. So counter data sets are collected outside of hegemonic mainstream counting institutions because their very purpose is to challenge those institutions to see, count, and value something or someone in the world differently. And just to say that when you start looking for counter data sets, you will start to find them everywhere. They're really proliferating in fields like data journalism, for example. And so one area that's very active in terms of counter data collection is COVID data, and specifically COVID data broken down by race, indigenous status, gender, and so on. But the example I want to focus on involves feminicide, and this is the gender-related killing of women and girls. So feminicide in Mexico and basically every other country in the world is another case of missing data sets. Feminicide is legally defined as a crime in 18 countries, including Mexico. And this is thanks to the strength of the Latin American feminist movement. But the state doesn't systematically collect data on the phenomenon, even though they have laws on the books about it. So because of that, this is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America, because of the way that the state neglects to implement its own laws and provisions. So in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who she resolved to head straight towards that problem and collect the missing data herself. And she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicide on a Google map that she culls from media reports. So she has helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. So in 2019, I was on sabbatical revising data feminism. I was living in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I started meeting with folks working on the issue of feminicide. And it turns out that Maria Salguero is by no means the only person collecting counter data on feminicide. There are many activists, civil society organizations, and journalists, especially in Latin America, who are doing this work. And it was around this time that I started working with Silvana Fumega at the Latin American Initiative for Open Data and Elena Suarez of the group Feminicidio Uruguay. And so we've since gone on to undertake qualitative and participatory design research with a number of the groups who are doing this counter data collection work. And what's emerging from these interviews is that the counter data sets created by civil society groups and activists are engaged in a back and forth contestational dialogue with many different groups. For example, while feminicide data sets use information from media and government sources, they create alternative categorization and labeling schemes that challenge the framings and the bias in those mainstream reports. And civil society groups' definition of feminicide is often much broader than a legal definition of feminicide, which often limits it to intimate partner violence. And then likewise, families of murdered women serve as both a source of cases for the database, so they often contact activists directly, as well as a key group that activists support. So for example, some groups run programs for grieving families and help them take broader action on the topic and seek justice for their loved ones. And again, the broader social movements coalescing around the topic of gender-based killing serve as both a source for compiling feminicide cases, as well as a key social group that can be mobilized when there's a new case included in the database. So I'd like to leave you today is with the provocation that Counterdata sets represent a powerful boundary object when we think about participatory machine learning, precisely because they are challenging mainstream, hegemonic, oppressive definitions of a social phenomenon as it has either been described on the one hand or ignored on the other hand in these mainstream data sets. So Counterdata sets are arguing for bringing into being an alternate political reality, and they should be an important site of participatory design and computational allyship for technologists. Because if we choose to work only with existing data sets created by mainstream counting institutions, we are potentially perpetuating a status quo that is sexist, racist, elitist, and more. So if you're interested in this work, you can check out a series of events that we're organizing this month or email me for a copy of our recent conference paper. Thank you so much.